The Duke of Ashford had a gift for silence, not the comfortable kind, not the silence of a library on a Sunday morning or the particular hush of a house after snow. His was the silence of a man who had decided some years ago that most conversations were not worth the breath they required, and who had arranged his life accordingly. He attended what he must. He spoke when spoken to, briefly. He looked at the women paraded before him each season with the same expression he wore when reviewing his quarterly accounts. Attentive, dispassionate, and faintly resigned. He was 29 years old, possessed of an earldom in Kent, a ducal title that had come to him unexpectedly at 22, and the kind of face that made painters request sittings and young women forget their own names. He had not, in 7 years of being the Duke of Ashford, found a single person who made him want to keep talking. He was, therefore, in the middle of the Hartwell charity auction, a dreadful affair held annually in the name of the Foundling Hospital and attended by everyone who wished to be seen attending, when he said something he had not intended to say aloud. He had been standing at the edge of the main hall with his friend Lord Carver, watching the proceedings with the expression of a man serving a sentence, when a woman crossed the room carrying a stack of ledgers that reached her chin. She was not dressed for the occasion. That was the first thing he noticed, not unkindly, simply as a fact. The other women wore the season's silks, in the season's colors, pale yellows, soft blues, the occasional daring rose. She wore deep green, a shade that had been fashionable 3 years ago and had the particular quality of fabric that has been cared for rather than replaced. Her dark hair was pinned simply. She carried the ledgers as though she had forgotten she was at a social event, which suggested either that she was very distracted or that she genuinely did not care, and something about the certainty with which she moved made him suspect the latter. She set the ledgers on the auction table, opened the top one, checked something, closed it, and moved on to the next table with the focused efficiency of a woman who had a list and intended to complete it. Lord Carver said something beside him. Ashford was not listening. "Who is that?" he said instead. Carver followed his gaze. "Miss Cecily Vane, younger daughter of Sir Edmund Vane, the baronet who lost most of his money in that railway scheme last year. She organizes the auction every year, apparently. Does it all herself. The committee rather lets her." He paused. "Rumor is the family can barely afford the season, but she comes anyway and runs other people's charity events." Ashford watched her move to a third table, check a third ledger, make a small correction with a pencil she produced from somewhere in her sleeve. "A charity case in silk," he muttered. He meant it as nothing. An observation. The kind of thing that passed through one's mind and was better left there. He knew that, even as the words left his mouth. They were quiet, directed at no one, half swallowed by the noise of the room. But the room, at that precise moment, chose to go briefly, inexplicably quiet. And Miss Cecily Vane, 3 feet away at the adjacent table, heard every word. She did not drop the ledger. She did not flush. She did not look at him with the wounded expression he might have expected, might have if he'd thought about it, which he hadn't because he had not intended to be heard. She looked up. Her eyes were dark brown, very steady, and currently occupied with the specific task of taking him apart. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I believe you're standing in front of the bid sheet for the Ashford Estate's annual contribution, which I note has not yet been submitted." She tilted her head precisely 1 degree. "Perhaps you'd like to remedy that now. The Foundling Hospital does so appreciate charity from those who can genuinely afford it." The room, the small portion of it that had heard, went very still. Lord Carver made a sound that he converted, unconvincingly, into a cough. Ashford looked at her. She looked back. She was not smiling exactly, but there was something in the set of her mouth that suggested she had enjoyed that rather more than was strictly polite, and had decided not to pretend otherwise. He stepped aside. He took the bid sheet. He wrote a figure that was, in retrospect, significantly larger than he'd planned, because his hand seemed to have made a decision independent of his brain. She watched him do it, glanced at the figure and said, "How generous," in a tone that made it entirely unclear whether she meant it. Then she picked up her ledgers and moved to the next table. Ashford stood there for a moment with the pen still in his hand. "Well," said Lord Carver, with the poorly suppressed delight of a man who had witnessed something extraordinary, That's the first time I've seen you outmaneuvered since Eton." Ashford said nothing. He set down the pen. He watched her cross the room, check another table, make another note, and speak to an elderly committee member with the brisk warmth of someone who was genuinely fond of the work. He left the auction 40 minutes later. On the carriage ride home, he constructed 3 separate responses to what she had said. All 3 were excellent. None of them would have landed as cleanly as hers. He realized, with something between irritation and fascination, not finished thinking about her. The re-encounter, he told himself, was necessary. He had been rude, inadvertently, yes, but rude nonetheless, and he was not a man who left things unresolved. He had his secretary make inquiries, discovered that Miss Vane was to attend the Hargreave musical evening on Thursday, and attended it himself for the first time in 3 years on the basis of this intelligence. He found her in the second row, listening to a soprano with the focused attention she apparently brought to everything, a small program in her hands that had been annotated in pencil in the margins. He sat beside her. She looked at the empty seat on her other side, then at the full rows behind them, then at him, with an expression of polite inquiry that said very clearly that she understood the calculation. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Vane. Are you fond of Scarlatti?" "I have no strong feelings about Scarlatti." "Then I wonder," she said pleasantly, "what you are fond of." He looked at her. "Efficiency," he said. "Competence, people who say what they mean." "How convenient," she said, turning back to the soprano. "I am all 3. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he was almost smiling. Over the following 3 weeks he attended 4 events he would not otherwise have attended. She was at all of them. She was, at all of them, doing something useful, organizing a seating arrangement, correcting an error in a program, quietly redirecting a conversation that had become unkind. She never performed these small interventions. She simply did them and moved on. And the people she helped often did not notice they had been helped. He noticed. He also noticed that she was careful with him. Not cold. She was never cold. Her warmth was one of the most immediately obvious things about her. The way she spoke to servants and committee members and elderly widows with the same direct attention she gave to anyone else. But with him, there was a layer of something measured, something that assessed each exchange before committing to it. She did not trust him yet. He found he wanted to change that with an urgency that was entirely new. The Duchess of Carver, Lord Carver's mother, a small, fierce woman of 60, who had known Ashford since he was 12 and had no patience for his silences, cornered him at the Pembury dinner and said, without preamble, "You're making a hash of it." "I beg your pardon." "Miss Vane, you follow her around events like a man who has lost something and isn't sure what it is. It's unbecoming." She helped herself to a glass of wine from a passing tray. "What you should do is talk to her. Properly, not this circling." "I talk to her. You fence with her, which she wins incidentally. I've been watching." The Duchess's eyes were sharp and rather amused. "She's remarkable, James. And she knows what you said at the Hartwell auction. Every woman in London knows what you said. If you want her to believe you've changed your assessment, you'll have to demonstrate it." She paused. "The girl has spent years being underestimated. She won't take your word for anything. She'll require proof." Ashford thought about this for the rest of the dinner. The proof, when he offered it, was not grand. He had learned from watching her that she did not respond to grand gestures. She responded to accuracy. The Hartwell Charity Committee had been attempting for 3 years to secure a proper venue for their winter gala. The Foundling Hospital's usual space was inadequate. The children's choir couldn't be properly heard. The auction tables were cramped, and the whole event raised less than it should because the setting communicated, however unintentionally, that the cause was not worth the trouble of a proper room. Ashford offered Ashford House. He sent the letter to the committee. He did not mention Miss Vane's name in it. He did not expect credit. He made one specification, that the event's logistics be managed by whomever the committee chose, without interference from his household. He learned 3 days later that the committee had unanimously chosen Miss Vane to manage the logistics, He learned this from Miss Vane herself, who appeared at Ashford House on a grey Tuesday morning with a notebook, a measuring tape, and an expression of someone who had been handed something she wasn't sure what to do with. He met her in the entrance hall. "The committee tells me you specified no interference from your household," she said. "I did. But you're here. It's my house." She considered this. "Then I'll need measurements of the East Gallery and the ballroom, and access to the kitchens to speak with your cook about the supper arrangements, and a list of what furniture can be moved and what cannot. I'll show you myself." She looked at him. "You'll show me the kitchens?" "I know where they are." Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite surprise. She opened her notebook. "Then we'd better start with the gallery. I have 4 hours. They spent those 4 hours moving through Ashford House with her notebook and his knowledge of which floors creaked and which doors stuck and where the light fell in the late afternoon. She measured and noted and asked questions that were always precise and never small talk, and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour he realized they had stopped fencing. It wasn't a dramatic shift. She simply asked, while measuring the distance between 2 columns in the East Gallery, whether the house had always felt this large or whether it had grown. And he said without thinking that it had grown when his father died, and he had been 22 and had not known how to fill it. She lowered the measuring tape. She looked at him, not with pity, which he would have hated, but with the direct attention she gave to everything. "How old were you when you decided not to try?" she asked. It was the most honest question anyone had asked him in 7 years. He stood there for a moment in the gallery with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows and said, 24, I think. Possibly 23. She nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer to a reasonable question, and went back to measuring. He found himself in the library that evening, not reading, thinking about the way she had asked that question, not as an accusation, not as a diagnosis, simply as a thing she wanted to know. He thought about the measuring tape and the notebook and the 4 hours and the fact that she had not once been performing for him. She had been working. He realized, working too. For the first time in some years, he had been entirely present in his own house. The gala preparations brought her to Ashford House 3 more times over the following fortnight. The 3rd time, she arrived in the early evening and the work ran late, and at some point the practical necessity of reviewing the final seating arrangements led them to the library, where the light was better and the fire was burning and the house was quiet. She spread the seating chart on the library table. He stood beside her. They were close enough that he could see the pencil annotations in the margins of her notes, small corrections, arrows, a question mark beside a name. "Lord Fenwick and Lady Fenwick cannot be adjacent," she said, pointing. "They've separated, and the Hartwell committee chair needs to be within speaking distance of the stage, not the far end. Move the Fenwicks to either side of the aisle. Put the committee chair here." He pointed. She made the adjustments. Her pencil moved quickly. He watched her hands, the efficiency of them, the absence of hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "Why the house? You could have made a donation, written a check. That's what dukes do." He was quiet for a moment. "You told me at the auction that the Foundling Hospital appreciates charity from those who can afford it. I wanted to give something that couldn't be dismissed." She looked up. The fire was burning low, and the light made the angles of her face very clear, and she was looking at him with the expression she'd had in the gallery, that direct, undisguised attention. "That's not the whole answer," she said. "No. What's the rest of it?" He looked at her. He had prepared nothing. He had, in fact, spent the last 3 weeks carefully not preparing anything, because preparation implied intention, and intention implied something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. "I wanted to demonstrate," he said carefully, "that my assessment at the auction was wrong." "Your assessment of the cause?" "My assessment of you." The silence stretched. The fire settled. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he watched something move through her expression. Not the armor going up, but something more complicated than that. Something that looked like wanting to believe him, and not yet being sure she should. "I've been underestimated for a long time," she said. Her voice was quiet, not wounded, simply factual, the way she was factual about everything. "I've learned to be careful about people who change their minds. It's sometimes genuine, it's sometimes just a different strategy. I know." You can't tell me which this is. I understand that. You'd say it was genuine regardless. She looked back at the seating chart. So I'll watch, and you'll show me, he said. Yes, she said. Good. And went back to the seating arrangements. He stood beside her in the library until the fire burned to embers and the chart was finished, and he thought that no conversation he could remember had cost him more and given him more in equal measure. The gala was, by every measurable standard, a triumph. The East Gallery held the choir perfectly. The auction tables were arranged so that the most significant items were visible from every angle. The supper ran precisely on schedule. The Foundling Hospital raised more in a single evening than it had in the previous 3 years combined. Miss Cecily Vane stood at the back of the gallery during the choir's performance with her notebook closed, watching it work, and Ashford stood 20 feet away and watched her. Lord Carver appeared at his elbow. You're staring. I'm observing. The distinction is becoming theoretical. Carver followed his gaze. She's extraordinary, James. Yes. And she's been talking to Viscount Pembury for the last quarter hour. He's been angling for an introduction to her family all season. Ashford looked. Viscount Pembury was 26, charming, well-connected, and possessed of the particular social ease that came from having never been wrong about anything important. He was currently making Miss Vane laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, which Ashford had heard only twice before and found himself unreasonably proprietary about. He's not serious, Carver said, with the air of someone offering comfort they know will not be accepted as such. He looks serious. Pembury is always charming. He's never serious. He'll move on when someone shinier arrives. Carver paused. The question is whether she knows that. Ashford set down his glass. He crossed the gallery with the deliberate unhurry of a man who was not, he told himself, jealous, who was simply ensuring that a woman he respected was not being charmed by someone who did not mean it. He reached them at the moment Pembury was saying something about the supper arrangements, which he was crediting with great warmth to the committee. The arrangements were Miss Vane's, Ashford said. Pembury turned, his smile recalibrated seamlessly. Ashford, magnificent evening. Miss Vane managed it entirely. So I was just hearing. Pembury looked at her with the full warmth of his attention. You're wasted on charity committees, Miss Vane. You should be running estates. Perhaps I should, she said pleasantly. Her eyes moved to Ashford's briefly, with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Pembury stayed another 10 minutes and then was claimed by someone across the room, and then he was gone, and Ashford was standing beside her in the gallery while the choir began a second piece. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. He was giving the committee credit for your work. People do that. They shouldn't. She looked at him. No, she said after a moment. They shouldn't. It was Pembury who found him 2 days later. Ashford was in his study when his secretary announced the Viscount, who arrived looking entirely at ease and sat down without being invited. I'll be direct, Pembury said. I've spoken to Sir Edmund Vane about his daughter. Ashford set down his pen. He's open to the idea, Pembury continued. The family's situation is, well, you know the situation. A viscount is a reasonable solution. He smiled pleasantly, with the ease of a man who had never considered that he might not be welcome. I thought it courteous to mention it to you first, given the obvious interest, but if you're not intending to act on it, I don't see why I should wait. Ashford looked at him for a long moment. Have you spoken to Miss Vane? I'll speak to her father first. That's how it's done. Is it? She's a sensible woman. She'll understand the practicalities. Ashford said nothing. He picked up his pen. He looked at the papers on his desk and thought about a woman who measured rooms with a tape measure and asked questions with the precision of a surgeon and had spent years being underestimated by men who thought practicalities were the same as her opinion. Thank you for the courtesy, he said. You may go. Pembury left, still smiling, still certain. Ashford sat for a moment. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went to find Miss Vane. He found her at the Hartwell Committee offices, which were 3 rooms above a milliner's shop on a narrow street in Mayfair, writing letters at a desk that had more organized stacks of paper on it than he had seen outside of a solicitor's office. She looked up when he came in. Her expression moved through surprise and settled on something watchful. "Viscount Pembury intends to speak to your father," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I see. I wanted you to know before he did." She put down her pen. She looked at him steadily. Why? He had asked himself this on the carriage ride over. He had several answers. All of them were true. Only one of them was the whole truth. "Because you told me you'd watch and I'd show you," he said. "And I want to show you this, that someone told you what was happening to you before it happened and asked what you wanted and waited for the answer." Something moved in her face. Something that was not the careful armor and was not the wit she used when she wasn't sure of him. Something quieter and more unguarded than either. "What I want," she said slowly, "is not to be a problem to be solved. Not by Pembury, and not by—" She stopped. "Not by me," he said. "Not by anyone. I know." "Do you?" He crossed the room. He stopped at the edge of her desk. He looked at her, not with the assessment she had seen from him in the early weeks, not with the careful distance he had maintained, but with something that had been building for 2 months and had run out of room. "I know that you have managed other people's events and organized other people's causes and made other people's rooms work for years, and that no one has thought to ask what you would do with a room of your own. I know that you are not a practicality or a solution or a charity case." His voice was steady. He kept it steady with effort. "I know that I said something careless and wrong, and that you answered it better than I deserved, and that everything I've done since has been because I wanted to be worth the answer." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to consider it, that's all." The silence in the small office above the milliner's shop stretched for a long moment. "You're not proposing," she said. "No." "Good." She looked at him. "Because I would refuse it." "I know. I would refuse it," she said again, more slowly. "Because you don't yet know me well enough to mean it, and I don't yet know you well enough to believe it." She picked up her pen. "But I think," she said carefully, "that both of those things might change." He looked at her. He felt something in his chest that was not quite relief and not quite happiness, but was something adjacent to both and larger than either. "Then I'll come back," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." He did come back. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and eventually the Tuesdays became other days as well, and the committee office gave way to the gallery at Ashford House, and the library, and long walks in the park that began as practical discussions about the hospital's next fundraising effort, and became something else entirely. Something neither of them named because they were both, in their different ways, careful people who had learned to be careful for good reasons. Sir Edmund Vane, who was a well-meaning man made weak by financial anxiety and a deep aversion to conflict, received Viscount Pembury's inquiry with visible relief. He received Ashford's request for permission to court his daughter 2 weeks later with visible terror, because one was a manageable proposition and the other was a duke, and a duke's interest had implications that a baronet in reduced circumstances did not know how to navigate. He said yes to both, which was the kind of decision that seemed practical and was actually a catastrophe. Cecily learned about Pembury's inquiry from her father. She learned about Ashford's from Pembury himself, who arrived at the committee office on a Thursday with his charm fully deployed, and said, with the air of someone delivering news he found personally amusing, "I should tell you that Ashford has spoken to your father before I did, which is interesting, given that I informed him of my intentions." He smiled. "He's moved quickly for a man who spent the better part of 2 months watching you from across rooms." "Has he?" she said. "I wonder," Pembury said pleasantly, "whether you've considered that a duke's interest in a woman of your situation tends to have a particular character. These things are often more about what's convenient than what's genuine. You're capable and discreet, and you understand how households run. That's useful." He tilted his head. "I'm not saying he doesn't admire you. I'm saying admiration and choosing are different things." She looked at him. She thought about a man who had offered his house without asking for credit, who had crossed a gallery to correct a misattribution, who had come to a committee office above a milliner's shop to tell her something was happening before it happened and to ask what she wanted. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "I'll take it under consideration." Pembury left satisfied. He had, she thought, genuinely believed he was helping her. That was the most useful thing about him. His confidence was so complete that it never occurred to him she might not need it. She thought about what he'd said for the rest of the afternoon. She was still thinking about it when Ashford arrived at 6 o'clock. She had not told him to come at 6, but she had not been surprised when he did, and stood in the doorway of the committee office with his hat in his hand. "Pembury came," she said. "I expected he would. He suggested your interest was convenient rather than genuine." He looked at her. "What do you think?" She considered him. She thought about 2 months of Tuesdays and other days, and the gallery and the library, and the question he had asked in the committee office about what she wanted, and the fact that he had waited for the answer. "I think," she said, "that convenient men don't spend 2 months demonstrating things to women who told them they'd have to be shown." Something in his expression shifted. The last of the careful distance, the final layer of the composure he wore like a second coat. Underneath it was something raw and very earnest and entirely unguarded. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. "James," she said. It was the first time she had used his. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the full weight of 2 months of accumulated attention and said, "I would like to ask you something, and I need you to know that I know you might refuse, and that if you do, I will have earned it, and I will accept it, and I will spend whatever time is required ensuring that I have not." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something inconvenient, and she was not going to mention it. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" The silence was different from the other silences. It was not the silence of assessment or the silence of careful armor. It was the silence of a woman standing at the edge of something she had told herself she did not want, because wanting it had always been too expensive. "You said," she said slowly, "at the committee office that you weren't asking me to trust you, only to consider it." "I know. This is rather more than consideration." "Yes. You've known me for 2 months." "I know. I refused you before you asked." "I remember." She looked at him. She thought about the charity case comment and the way she had answered it, and the fact that he had never, not once, tried to pretend it hadn't happened or minimize what it had meant. He had simply worked, steadily and without fanfare, to demonstrate that it was wrong. "I have conditions," she said. Something flickered in his expression, not disappointment, something closer to relief. "Tell me." "The committee work continues. I don't become a duchess and disappear into a house. The committee work continues. And the Foundling Hospital Gala is at Ashford House every year, not as a favor, as a standing arrangement. Done. And if you ever say something careless again, you will tell me," he said, "immediately, and I will listen." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman she had been 3 months ago, organized and efficient and careful, managing other people's rooms, making other people's events work, entirely invisible to the people she served. She thought about being seen, not performed at, not assessed, not found convenient. Seen. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He exhaled. It was the most unguarded sound she had ever heard from him, a long breath released, as though he had been holding it for some time. He took her hand. His grip was careful and very certain. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you were never a charity case. You were the only competent person in the room. I was simply the last to understand it." "I know," she said, "but I appreciate you saying it." The wedding was in October, at the small church near the Ashford estate in Kent, with the leaves turning gold outside the windows and the Foundling Hospital choir singing in the gallery above. The vows were the traditional ones, but Cecily had added a line that the vicar had raised an eyebrow at, and she had declined to remove. "I choose you, not because you are convenient, but because you are worth the choosing." Ashford had added one of his own, in the same spirit. "I will spend the rest of my life demonstrating it." The Duchess of Carver wept. Lord Carver did not, but his jaw was very tight throughout, which amounted to the same thing. 2 years later, on a Tuesday in November, Ashford came home to find his wife at the library table, with a new set of ledgers and a cup of tea gone cold, and their daughter, 18 months old, and possessed of her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn composure, asleep in a basket by the fire. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "The hospital board approved the new wing," she said. "Construction begins in spring." "I know. I signed the papers this morning. You didn't tell me. I wanted to see your face when you found out." She looked at him. Something warm and unguarded moved through her expression, the expression she had stopped trying to contain approximately 14 months ago, when she had concluded that containing it was more effort than it was worth. "Tell me again," she said. It had become a ritual between them, the particular shorthand of a couple who had a beginning worth retelling. He reached across the table and took her hand. "A charity case in silk," he said with the particular gravity of a man reciting scripture. "I said it. You heard it, you answered it, and you spent 2 months being shown up." "Instructed," he said. "The word is instructed." "The word," she said, "is shown up." He smiled, a real one, the kind that had taken her 2 months to earn the first time and now arrived with the ease of long practice. "And then I asked you to marry me. I refused you. And then I asked you again. And I had conditions, which I accepted." "Which you accepted," she agreed. She looked at him across the library table, with the cold tea and the new ledgers and the sleeping child by the fire. "It was a good answer," she said, "to the conditions." "It was a good question," he said. "The first time." She squeezed his hand. Outside the library windows, the November wind moved through the Kent countryside, and inside the fire burned steadily, and the child slept, and the ledgers waited, and the Duke of Ashford sat across from his wife in the room where he had first understood what it meant to be entirely present in his own house, and thought that some things, arrived at slowly and honestly, and with considerable instruction, were worth every moment of the earning. Thank you for staying with Cecily and James until the very end. Their story began with a careless word and became something neither of them expected, a love built not on rescue or convenience, but on the slow, stubborn work of being worth the answer. If you loved watching a woman refuse to be underestimated and a man learn what it means to be shown up by the right person, there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss them. You are the reason these stories exist, and I am so grateful you were here.